by way of background, I guess there's a few questions I'm going to throw out with one question with some possibilities, and we can revisit this question at the end of the talk. And it's the question of this panel: is Europe safe for Jews? There are three possibilities as I see it right now. Having lived as a Jew in Europe now for 13 years, I know Simone Dion Hartmann is here, this young woman who's an Austrian Jew. I'm singling her out, who knows more about this phenomenon than I do, having grown up in Austria. But there are three possibilities right now for European Jews as I see it. Jews could make Aliyah, relocate to Israel. European Jews can self-organize, form defense groups, pack heat, as we've seen in Italy, where there's a large group of Italian Jews who are highly organized and are willing to strike back and are, so to speak, weaponized. And that's why there hasn't been these types of lethal anti-Semitic attacks in Italy. Michael Ledeen, many of you might know that name. He's the Freedom Scholar at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He speaks fluent Italian. He's written about Italian Jews fighting back and self-organizing. So that's an interesting possibility. Although the Danish Jewish community on the night of the attack earlier this year, when a jihadi killed a Jewish security guard at the synagogue in Copenhagen, based on what I've read, there was some semblance of organization there in terms of self-defense, but it didn't work. The third possibility is European Jews can relocate to mainly the Anglo-American world, not England. I don't consider England right now a welcome country, but the United States, Canada, Australia looks pretty good these days. If the conservative government, I suspect, continues this line of countering anti-Semitism. So we can revisit that later. I would add that for American Jews, and given the Second Amendment here, there's always been, at least the surveys I've read, many American Jews are reluctant to endorse, for example, the views of the NRA or the Second Amendment. I think American Jews, if many of them spent a few months in Europe, they would be card-carrying members of the NRA, based on what's happened in Europe over the last 2 years. I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but it's not. It's a very difficult situation. It's not pleasant when you have these types of attacks and indifference from European leaders, and I mean from a policy perspective, not from a rhetorical perspective, where European leaders will scream the revolutionary phrase of opposing anti-Semitism, but practice the soggy reformist deed of not outlawing jihadi groups that are killing Jews. And many of you probably read this. Amnesty International issued a statement that during a conference, a resolution was pushed by a non-Jewish member asking that Amnesty pursue research or put out a white paper countering anti-Semitism, and the resolution was rejected by the members of Amnesty International in London. And then Amnesty tweeted, I believe yesterday, we just don't have enough time and space to deal with this issue of anti-Semitism. At the same time, Amnesty, I believe, put out 140 pages, I'm not sure the exact number, it was 100+ paper on the rise of Islamophobia in Europe. But there's no time for anti-Semitism. This is the same organization in 2010 in which a director of their Finnish branch in Finland and in Helsinki declared on a blog for the third largest paper in Finland that Israel is a scum state. That's what he wrote. He justified it. He based it on his empirical interactions with Israelis over the years. And when I confronted him after a friend in Helsinki told me this just appeared, I was sort of in a half state of disbelief, but we went through the translation again, and it was accurate, and I called Frank Johansson, the Finnish director of Amnesty, and I asked him, why, did you make this remark? Yes. Why? Well, Israel's a scum state. I said, well, are there any other states that you would define as a scum state. No, but there are some Russian officials I would compare to being scum. And again, I asked him, what could you base this on? Well, I was in Israel a number of years ago, and I had some bad interactions, and these are how Israelis are. Again, this is the director of one of the leading human rights organizations in Europe. After I published my article, the office in London realized there was some problem and went into a state of panic. They told me that the translation might have been problematic. It might have been something along the lines of just scum, or there was some problem with the translation. I can't remember, but it was basically the same word, and it didn't minimize what he said. I think actually what she told me was, excuse the crude language, what he actually meant or could have been translated as douchebag, as if that made it better. In any event, this was my conversation with Amnesty in London, so you get a sense of the clinical insanity right now of the human rights world. So Frank Johansson did apologize, but if you're wondering why Amnesty is not investigating anti-Semitism, just look to why he still has his job and he wasn't summarily dismissed in 2010. Any other human rights representative who would make those remarks would have been summarily dismissed, certainly in the United States, I would hope. I would say the problem in Europe is, and I'm sketching this in a very broad way, but defining anti-Semitism is this Socratic exercise that goes on endlessly in Europe. And I know it takes place in the United States, but my sense in Europe is many people, many segments of society feel that anti-Semitism is something where you're literally putting European Jews in cattle cars and carting them off to Sachsenhausen or Auschwitz. Anything below that level is questionable. Now, I'm being a bit hyperbolic, but you get the sense of what I'm saying, that unless who is an anti-Semite? In Europe, another problem is there's all sorts, Europeans will agree, the elites, the intelligentsia, the chattering classes, we have anti-Semitism. When I ask who are the anti-Semites, they'll say we have anti-Semitism. I'll say, well, where are these anti-Semites? Well, they're part of the society. So you have anti-Semitism without anti-Semites, which is another problem. When you start to get to the point where you have anti-Semites and you can identify those figures, then you can begin to influence a change in society. So there's a reluctance to labeling individuals who are stoking anti-Semitism. As many of you probably know too, the Europeans developed a working definition of anti-Semitism in 2004 at the Berlin Conference. The conference was organized by the German Green Party, Joschka Fischer, who has an honorary degree from the University of Haifa. And he was at this event with the Greens and all policymakers, and they adopted a so-called working definition of anti-Semitism. That definition is largely Sharansky, Natan Sharansky's 3D definition, which I'm sure many of you know, the double standards, the demonization. And what's missing from this definition, I would add, though, is and I think I mentioned this last year, is attacking Jews or Israel as warmongers or individuals who stoke jingoism. And this is a key facet of the definition that should be part of a definition, because as you've seen, Israel's self-defense wars, many Europeans, again, I'm looking at it from a European perspective, view Israel as a warmongering power. And this is the same type of rhetoric that was used in the 1930s in Germany to stoke hatred against Jews, that they're part of a war apparatus. So I do think that point should be emphasized in these discussions about contemporary anti-Semitism, because there's been a huge resurgence of it, even during the Iraq War, when Europeans were targeting certain politicians, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Perle. They were attacking, of all the advisors or government officials from the Bush administration, they singled out the Jews. And I can think of one cartoon in the Berliner Zeitung, a Berlin Daily. But it was, again, what was driving this was these are the Jews who are creating warlike conditions, who are seeking interventions, military interventions, and we must stop them because they're a threat to the world. It's similar to what the Günter Grass poem, which many of you remember from, let's see, when was that? 2012, I believe. What Must Be Said, this anti-Israeli poem that appeared in the Süddeutsche, where he labeled Israel, right, as a threat to world peace. Again, that type of thinking that's not captured by a lot of sophisticated anti-Semitism definitions, including the State Department's, which is also based on the Sharansky view. In any event, fast forward 2004, the Europeans sort of agree on this working definition. 2012, 13, during that period, the Europeans eliminate the definition. They don't want to adhere to it anymore, but they're all against anti-Semitism, but we don't know what it is. At least with this definition, you have a working sense of what anti-Semitism is, especially for cultures like Germany, which are very, many Germans like definitions, they like paragraphs, they like quasi-judicial, things in public policy. And suddenly, you don't have a definition, so it's very nebulous. And there was zero resistance from Germany on the elimination of this quasi-legal definition of anti-Semitism. So let me fast forward now to the second wave of lethal anti-Semitism. In 2009, there was an interesting example. There was an al-Qaeda cell in Hamburg. As folks remember, that Hamburg was sort of the percolating ground for the 9/11 terrorists. Right? They attended school in Hamburg and then worked their way over to the States. They also attended a famous mosque that was called the 9/11 Mosque. Took the Germans 10 years to shut it after 2001. In 2011, which again is kind of stunning because what was being discussed at that mosque was hatred of Jews, all the wild anti-American conspiratorial theories, promoting Islam. In 2009, a second cell developed in this mosque in Hamburg. It was called the second 9/11 cell. A number of German Muslims, Afghanis, Syrians, different origins, traveled to the Pakistan-Afghanistan war theaters. Interestingly, they went through Iran, which establishes a long-held theory, or not theory, but it's empirically proved that Iran has been playing both sides of the fence. They allow al-Qaeda to reside in Iran. At the same time, they sort of put them under quasi-house arrest, but they have their hands in all different pies. What the authorities thought of it, why they allowed this mosque to train and or recruit al-Qaeda operatives for so long. These are the questions that are not being answered by the government. They're not even questions, these questions are not being posed, unfortunately, by journalists to government officials. How could you allow this mosque to continue to operate when this type of thinking was being formed and encouraged? Next phase of lethal anti-Semitism in Europe was, as many folks know, the 2012 murders that Mohamed Merah perpetrated in France. Killed 4 French Jews, including 3 young children in Toulouse, and of course he killed a number of French soldiers of Algerian descent. This is what Mohamed Merah said at the time. Many folks probably remember this quote, "I kill Jews in France as these are the same Jews who kill innocents in Palestine," close quote. So again, he's identifying European Jews with Israel, and that's what's animating his anti-Semitism. His brother, Abdelkader, explained what informed his brother's world outlook, and his outlook. "My mother always said, we, the Arabs, we were born to hate Jews. This speech, I heard it all throughout my childhood." Again, this is going on in France prior to the Charlie Hebdo attack, but you hear speeches opposed to anti-Semitism, but this is widespread thinking among many French Muslims. Again, fast forward in the same year, that those killings took place in the spring, and now we're in the summer of July of 2012. I was in Israel at the time in not a delicatessen, a grocery store, and I see the flashes of a bus that exploded in Burgas, Bulgaria, the seaside resort. Hezbollah and Iran target an Israeli tour bus, blow it up, killing 5 Israelis and their Bulgarian Muslim bus driver, severely injuring 32 Israelis. According to the United States government at the time, it was a joint Iran Hezbollah operation. Today, by the way, if you go on the website of the State Department, finally, almost 3 years later, the State Department listed 2 of the killers from this terrorist attack in 2012 as global terrorists. They're both living in southern Lebanon, or they may be in southern Beirut or southern Lebanon. I've heard different stories. But they're still there. Bulgaria's asked for their extradition. The Lebanese have refused. Bulgaria said they were going to hold a trial in absentia. That hasn't happened. So 3 years later, Europe has not done much to pursue two men who committed lethal anti-Semitism. Again, I think showing this disconnect between rhetoric on one side of the fence and action on the other side of the fence. The Europeans did, and it's important to cite that they did outlaw Hezbollah's military wing in 2013 after the Bulgarians proved that Hezbollah's so-called military wing was responsible for the killing of the Israelis and the Bulgarian bus driver, but they allowed their political wing to operate in Europe. Hezbollah does not define itself as an organization with a political and military wing. It defines itself as an organization with it's a monolithic organization, so it's a distinction without a difference. So the Europeans, in this case, sort of felt, they felt good, we did something, but practically Hezbollah operates in Europe, and they operate to conduct the killing of Jews. They had meetings in Lyon, France, prior to the Burgas attack, and Denmark, 2 countries that were recently in the news. I could go through the list of, as I mentioned, this running list of horrors in terms of in Belgium, an elderly Jewish woman wasn't treated by a doctor. I mean, there's all sorts of anti-Semitism unfolding. Chancellor Angela Merkel's response at a rally on September 14th in Berlin in front of the Brandenburger Gate, I was present reporting for foreign policy and the Jerusalem Post, she responded that, let me quote her, she lambasted, quote, pretend criticism of Israel, close quote, as an, quote, open quote, expression of Jew hatred at pro-Palestinian demonstrations, close quote. There was one sentence in her speech identifying or linking anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. To her credit, that was her response. Minister Valls of France, who's been the most outspoken critic of anti-Semitism in Europe, said, we're at war with jihadism and terrorism, not against Islam and Muslims. I say to the people in general who perhaps have not reacted sufficiently up to now, and to our Jewish compatriots, that this is a time anti-Semitism cannot be accepted. Great speech. Everyone was euphoric about this speech. It was on all of the Jewish newspaper websites. It was being quoted everywhere. But Hezbollah is still legal in France. So my question is, what does this rhetoric really mean when you're allowing an organization that's murdered Jews on European soil, including as recently as 2012, that promotes not only the destruction of the state of Israel, but the murder of Jews worldwide, as Hassan Nasrallah has said in speeches, including in 1997, when we said wherever Jews are worldwide, we have to kill them. France, again, allows Hezbollah to raise funds in its country. So does Germany. These funds are transferred to the Middle East. Those funds can be used to pay for suicide bombers, can be used to pay for Hezbollah operatives who want to cross the border in northern Israel into Israel or shoot missiles or mortars, as we saw earlier this year, in which many Israeli soldiers were killed in a Hezbollah counterattack. So this is the state of the fight against lethal anti-Semitism. Speeches, but at this point, very little, in fact, no policy changes, except heightened security, as many of you probably saw those pictures in the New York Times and other papers of Jewish schools in Belgium and France being guarded by soldiers. You know, it's a dismal state. You know, I would imagine most Americans, you know, or all Americans wouldn't want to live like that, where your children have to be guarded by soldiers. A lot of the European indifference, and Simone certainly can talk about this, to anti-Semitism, at least from a policy perspective, I think has to do with this is one factor, it's not the only factor in terms of explanatory power, the reaction to the Holocaust. In Germany, in Austria, but it's mainly a German phenomenon that's now spread. There's a famous quote, I frequently say this, Simone's heard it a million times, but there's an Israeli psychoanalyst, Zivi Rex, many of you may have heard this quote, where he said in the 80s, Germany will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. So he said it with sarcasm, right? Germany will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz. Meaning that in response to the Shoah, many Europeans, Germans, are filled with a pathological sense of guilt, and that guilt is animating them to bash Israel as a way to come to some form of catharsis. My theory is now, it's no longer the Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz, it's the Europeans will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust. So the factor, what you're seeing now, and this is what I've written about for the Jewish, for different journals, is a pan-epidemic of Europe immersed in guilt about the Holocaust. Not just Germany, but France. Remember France, Vichy regime. Other European countries are sort of coming to terms with their complicity in the destruction of European Jewry. They're now, you know, these Norway and other countries. So there's sort of a rising level of guilt, and you have this situation. And I'm saying this again, putting this in scary quotes. It's this phenomenon of the Europeans will never forgive the Israelis for the Holocaust, and that's why you see motions like, you know, we want to demarcate Israeli products from the disputed territories. Last week, the European governments, the majority of them, are planning an initiative to label products from the disputed territories as a way to impose discipline and punishment on the Jewish state. I've written about this initiative for many years. Israel is the only country right now that the European Union wants to whose products Europe wants to demarcate. I've asked European officials, there's no other territorial dispute right now that Europe is concerned about where they want to label products. I asked about North Cyprus, zero. Turks, their occupation, zero. China, Tibet, zero. We're not going to label those products. Crimea, Russia, we're not going to label those products. Western Sahara, Morocco, we're not going to label those products. The German Greens attempted to do this within the Bundestag. And the reason I'm mentioning this is part of lethal anti-Semitism because it contributes to this climate of endless ad nauseum bashing of Israel, which for Europeans, as I've mentioned, embodies the Jews. So this constant effort to strip Israel and Jews of their sovereignty, their personal freedoms, through these different measures. The German Bundestag, several years ago, the Green Party in the Bundestag initiated a similar initiative to demarcate Israeli products. I read the questionnaire. It's very long, very extensive. I mean, I was stunned. While Assad was wiping out Syrians, the Green Party must have spent months and months delving into research and formulating questions. And the amount of time and energy that went into this could have been used to fight anti-Semitism, but they wanted to demarcate Israeli products. When I confronted the Green Party with a similar initiative from a local neo-Nazi party, the National Democratic Party, which is the Nazi party in Germany. It's a right-wing extremist party, but they have some representation in a city council. It's not in the federal government. It's not in the state government, as far as I know. They have representatives in a small town called Schwerin in East Germany. They have a couple lunatics who are there on the city council. They formulated a resolution saying Israeli products should be demarcated. We want to know which products are coming from the disputed territories so that consumers are informed. So I read their questionnaire. This took place, I believe, a year before the Green Party. I went to the Green Party and I said, did you folks actually copy the Nazi initiative? The language is practically identical. Of course, the Green Party went berserk they wouldn't answer my question. They, just said, how dare you equate us with the Nazis? We had nothing to do with their initiative. It's our initiative. But they pursued their initiative. And that's what folks need to think about. I just came from a debate yesterday in Baltimore, at the Baltimore Law School, with a representative of J Street. Alan Dershowitz was there. He spoke. And then I had a debate with Alan Elsner, who's the spokesperson or deputy spokesperson for J Street. And J Street, he stated they're opposed to BDS. When I asked him about labeling of products, he said, well, that's a gray area. Again, the failure to understand that this is a very slippery slope. In Europe, the labeling of products, Israeli products from the disputed territories, is a de facto boycott of Israel. Everyone in Europe knows what that means. There are labels on products coming from the disputed territories. That sends a message: Israel's not kosher. There's something wrong with this state. We should avoid all of their products. I don't think I convinced J Street to view this as a boycott, even though they state they're opposed to this type of BDS, or opposed to BDS. But they seem to have, there's a weird form of cognitive dissonance going on in their heads about what it means to counter BDS. So I'll end on that note. I know you'll go home in a state of euphoria after this talk. So thanks for listening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.